Fantasy football. T5 League Yearly Review.
All right, in this matchup, we're going to be reviewing Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets going up against Jakobi Meyers of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, prior to jumping into any of the offseason mock drafts or the actual 2024 fantasy statistics for each player, I tend to favor Wilson. I targeted him last year in my draft. I really thought with Aaron Rodgers, he was going to produce a potential top 5 in the position, if not number 1. This year, of course, he's going to be playing with a new quarterback. We're about to jump into that. But he didn't meet my expectations last year, so I'm going to take that into consideration. And then Jakobi Meyers very much surprised me. He came over from New England, was playing for the Raiders. The Raiders had gotten rid of Devontae Adams. It was kind of an interesting situation where Meyers found himself in the number 1 wide receiver position. So we'll dive into how he ended up filling into that role and whether or not we expect him to be the WR1 for the Raiders in this upcoming season. So let's focus on the Jets. First of all, in the offseason, they've already made a ton of noise. They did sign quarterback Justin Fields to a 2-year sort of prove-it deal for them. They also signed wide receiver Tyler Johnson, wide receiver Josh Reynolds, and tight end Stone Smart. Josh Reynolds is expected to be a starter in the wide receiver core along with Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard, unless something happens during the draft where they pull in another outside target. That's most likely going to be their starting 3. They also did sign some backups for the offensive line, which is important, such as center Josh Myers and offensive tackle Chukwuma Okorafor. The only concerns for fantasy owners is going to be the performance of Justin Fields. Last year, he had 6 starts, which he did go 4-2 for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and they don't have as good of a wide receiver core as the New York Jets do, but he really struggled moving the ball down the field. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not he develops further under the Jets and what that means for Garrett Wilson. When we consider the Jets in the mock drafts, a lot of the information that I found or a lot of the speculation surrounding the Jets involve them targeting an offensive lineman in the 1st or 2nd round and then a defensive lineman in the 1st or 2nd round. I didn't see anything where there was like a wide receiver option within those first 2 rounds that made me believe that Wilson would be potentially going up against competition for targets. So I think that we're pretty safe bet that Wilson's going to have Wilson will be set up for a premier season. When we flip over to the Las Vegas Raiders, we also seen some chaotic offseason moves from them so far. One of those moves included a trade for quarterback Geno Smith from the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Geno Smith has been putting up excellent fantasy numbers over the last couple of years. That bodes very well for Jakobi Meyers' potential output. They did also sign veteran running back Raheem Mostert. Now, the Raheem Mostert signing was very interesting to me, especially with his performance in Miami over the past 2 years. But I believe that they're most likely going to address that in this upcoming draft. A lot of the mock drafts, analysts, and fans have the Raiders targeting Ashton Jeanty from Boise State. Very likely that Jeanty will come in and be the RB1 option. Moser will serve as a rotator, probably for like quarterback packages and protections. So that should add a little bit more of a threat in the backfield for the Raiders, which is promising for Meyers, right? That means they might have more men in the box to stop the run, allowing Meyers better opportunities, either from the slot position or outside the numbers. Now, based off of that, and if we go further into the draft, we don't see the Raiders really targeting any additional offensive weapons that we should be concerned about as a fantasy owner. So Jakobi Meyers' stock is going to still, if anything, is increased during the offseason and potentially will increase based off of the draft results. So with that being said, we're ready to go ahead and jump into our season stats. We're going to do our comparison for the 2024 fantasy season, and we'll see who came out on top. So the stats, this one ended up being a lot closer than even I anticipated. We'll start with Garrett Wilson. Garrett had 5 weeks where he was a bust and 3 weeks where he was a boom. He did finish 10th overall in the player rankings. His best week was in week 5 against Minnesota, where he had 13 receptions for 101 yards, 1 touchdown on 23 targets. Now, of course, we're going to see a great drop off in the targets with the arrival of Devontae Adams in the back half of the season, but still, 23 targets is pretty absurd. He only managed 29.1 points in fantasy that week, and I mean, that's still great, but a lot of people, if they're seeing 23 targets that are true number ones, I'm expecting them to put up at least 35 points. And then when we switch over and take a peek at Jakobi Meyers and how he did during the season, he had 5 weeks where he was a bust, 3 weeks where he was a boom, and he finished with a player ranking of 19. His best week came the last week of the season, week 18, against the Los Angeles Chargers, where he had 9 receptions for 123 yards, 1 touchdown on 10 targets. So a high efficiency game for him. That week, he managed 27.3 points, which was also his season high. Correction. Garrett Wilson's best week was actually week 9 against the Houston Texans, where he had 9 receptions for 90 yards, 2 touchdowns on 10 targets. So high efficiency week for him, those 2 touchdowns putting him over the edge in fantasy, and he did get 30 points that week. So I misspoke on the week 5 against Minnesota, where he had 29.1. Now, when we look at the season totals, Garrett Wilson had 101 receptions for 1,104 yards, 7 touchdowns on 154 targets. He did have 2 carries for 5 yards, but fantasy-wise, irrelevant. He finished with 252 points, good enough for number 10 ranking at the wide receiver position. Jakobi Meyers had 87 receptions for 1,027 yards. He had 4 touchdowns on 129 targets, so very respectable numbers. He had 2 carries for 23 yards, fantasy irrelevant, and he ended the season with a total of 218 fantasy points, good enough for the 19th player ranking. Now, Wilson had Rodgers throwing to him. Myers, they had a little bit of a quarterback carousel going on with the Raiders. Myers will have Geno Smith throwing to him this year, and Wilson's going to have Justin Fields throwing to him this year. If this was a conversation about the quarterbacks alone, I'm favoring Geno Smith versus Justin Fields. But when it comes to the wide receiver talent, there really isn't a wide receiver in the league that I don't like more than Garrett Wilson. His Houston performance saw him take in 2 amazing touchdown catches. One of those very controversial in the back of the end zone where he barely got the shin, I believe, inbounds prior to going out that they ruled. So it really is a lot more challenging considering the offseason moves, what we're expecting for the draft, and what we're going to forecast for their potential outcome. The New York Jets have Breece Hall, so they should have a pretty reliant running game that they can lean on, but the offensive line was kind of horrendous. If they're not able to reinforce that offensive line during the draft, I think that we're going to see Justin Fields under a lot of pressure, a lot of scrambling out of the pocket, which may bode well for Garrett Wilson. A little backyard football might confuse the defenses, allow him to make bigger plays out of nothing, kind of similar to what we saw from Fields in Chicago whenever he first connected with DJ Moore. Now, Jakobi Meyers, he's going to have Geno Smith. If the Raiders do end up getting Genty in the offseason, that's going to really reinforce the run game. So I do, based on, like, as I mentioned earlier, I do expect defenses to have to stack the box a little more often. Plus, they have Brock Bowers, who set tight end records for the franchise and NFL last year. Defenses are going to be giving him a lot of attention. So we have our decision time. Who are we going to pick between the two? I have not seen enough evidence to rule out Garrett Wilson as being the better option against Jakobi Meyers. So Garrett Wilson, congratulations. You're going to advance to our second round. Jakobi Meyers, even though this was a very close matchup, you're going to be on the bench. All right, So you have you have my conclusion. Garrett Wilson advances. Jakobi Meyers is out. We're almost done with round 1. We're going to get into round 2, where we're going to do a little more rapid fire in these comparisons in order to get through this WR1 elimination bracket. So if you disagree or if you prefer Meyers over Wilson, please let me know in the comments section. We always appreciate a like and subscribe to help kind of prop up the channel. All right, have a good one.